Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Nice. I'm Brigitte Stenhouse. I'm a lecturer in the history of mathematics at the Open University, so I'm based in the maths department. So most of my teaching is in mathematics, but my research is in the history of the subject. So first, I'll just say a little bit about the papers that I'm going to be speaking about today, and kind of why they're important and why, where the transcription project came from. The papers I'm going to be talking about are those of the mathematician Mary Somerville. So she was a 19th century scientist, mathematician, astronomer, polymath. She also painted this self-portrait, so she's very much the 19th century woman that you would expect Mr. Darcy to view as successful in that hilarious bit in Pride and Prejudice. But anyway, she became known as a mathematician through submitting solutions to questions published in question and answer journals. So interestingly, these have already been digitized on archive.org, which is sort of making her a little bit more visible, except for the fact that she published these under a pseudonym of a lady. She was by the time she was submitting, she was one of very few women to be involved in this. So it's very likely that all of these ladies were her. As a testament to just how sort of widely known she was as a mathematician, by 1826, she was actually commissioned to write a translation of a work by Laplace into English. His book, Mécanique Céleste, had reduced all of the motions of the solar system to the application of mathematical formulae. And so you could do things like say, hey, in 5 years, that planet's going to be right there, and then people in 5 years could point their telescope at the sky and see the planet that they were expecting to see. And so this was incredibly powerful. You could map phenomena that took place over more than a human lifetime, or that was so microscopic that the telescopes weren't even strong enough to see that phenomena. And so this was a really important work. But unfortunately, the mathematics was very different to the style of mathematical practice in the UK, which is why she was asked to write this translation, to bring it over not just from French into English, but also to make it readable to a British audience. Interestingly, after this book, mathematics sort of disappears from her published works. She did write a series of incredibly successful books, which were surveys of recent scientific developments. She was incredibly plugged in to the scientific community in London of the day. So people like Michael Faraday would write to her with the results of his experiments, and these would sometimes appear in her books before they appeared in his published papers. So that's kind of how plugged in she was. Her books went through multiple editions. They all sold really well. And she even won a medal for her book on physical geography. Perhaps the reason that her books sold so much better than her first translation of Laplace is because she'd taken all the mathematical formulae out. Something true then, as is perhaps true now. But she did continue advocating for the power of mathematics, the importance of not just understanding the phenomena, the scientific phenomena, but also understanding the mathematics that people had used to make these discoveries. So rather than things always being discovered through experiment, you could now discover new knowledge through the application of mathematics, something incredibly powerful that she does talk about a lot, even if it's very invisible if she was doing any of that work herself. Which is where her archives come in. To witness her as a mathematician, we can't just focus on her published works. We need to turn to her papers, which she very kindly kept together. And they were looked after by her family, and I'll speak a bit more about that in a minute. So one incredibly important collection that exists as regards Mary Somerville is her library of books. So this is a collection that she sort of gathered from around 1820 until her death in 1872. So it's very extensive, and it's been incredibly thoroughly catalogued by Girton College in Cambridge. So when she died in 1872, Girton was one of very few colleges for women that existed. So her daughters donated her library, which contains lots of mathematical books, to the college. In her lifetime, Somerville was very aware of just how important this personal library was. She was, as a woman, she was ineligible for memberships of the Royal Society, other learned societies. She couldn't go to university, she couldn't work at university. So all of these spaces in which men would go to access books, access people, she couldn't do that. She had to find other ways. Although I will say another way that she accessed those books is she had a very helpful husband who was a member of those societies, and she would send him off with a to-do list of, I would like this book and I need you to ask this person this question. So he was a very helpful husband, but that is an entire topic for another day. Something really great about this collection of books is that they have been really well catalogued by Girton. So you can just go online and you can see which books have marginalia. The books haven't been digitized, but at least you kind of know a bit of what you might find when you get to the archive. So yeah, they mention marginalia, they mention if the book's been inscribed. Loads of the books say to Mary Somerville with the great esteem of the author, again showing just how plugged in she was to these networks. She was being gifted these books. You can also see that some of the books have pages uncut, which means she probably didn't read them, which is also helpful to know sometimes. Another incredibly useful collection is the collection of the Somerville papers at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So these are Somerville's personal papers. There's thousands of letters, which Somerville actually started cataloguing herself near the end of her life. So they still have a lot of the big brown envelopes that she put the letters in. She put them in alphabetical order. For the people who she thought were particularly notable, she's written little notes of these letters are from William Wallace. He was incredibly helpful and I'm in his debt. Little things, little notes like that to go with the letters. Unfortunately, not all of so this collection was sort of stewarded by her family until the 1960s. And when it was then gifted to Somerville College, which did not exist when she died, but did exist 7 years later, and must have seemed like as good a place as any to leave Somerville's papers, as the college was named after her. They wanted to name it after a woman who was known for her scientific achievement, and so it was a good place for those papers to go. They were catalogued by Elizabeth Chambers Patterson in the 60s and early 70s. But something very interesting is if two people look at the exact same papers, they will catalogue them in very different ways. And so the mathematics doesn't always turn up in the catalogue, which sometimes is really helpful for me because it means that I can keep doing research because no one knows that stuff is there. But sometimes it does mean I'm taken very much by surprise. So two of the main mathematical resources that we have are manuscripts of books that she wrote in the 1830s. So this is the same time she's writing these non-mathematical books. She also wrote two full-length manuscripts. One's an introductory textbook, one is a continuation of her Laplace translation. Neither of these were ever published. And it's kind of amazing that she held on to these drafts for 40 years. She moved around Italy, she didn't have a stable home for most of that time, but somehow she managed to keep hold of these papers and keep them together. And actually in her late 80s, she started revising them and updating them. And so some of the papers, by looking at these manuscripts, we can also see some of the work that went into that. So they're incredibly interesting. And from a note that is on the front of the envelope, we can see that she was considering that maybe these would be published after her death, but unfortunately they were not. One of the things that took me by surprise is that this is actually a page from a draft of her personal recollections. So this is her autobiography that she started writing in her late 80s. And while she's sort of talking, she's reflecting on how mathematics has changed throughout her life. And then as you can see around the corner of the draft, she's kind of used it as rough paper for some mathematical jottings. And these are just not mentioned at all in the catalogue. So I thought I was going in to find a quote that I wanted to get a tattoo of. And then I just happened to come across this and I was like, great, now I have a whole research project to do. And I have not yet gotten that tattoo for various other reasons. But anyway, it's a really good quote, which comes at the end of this talk. So yeah, it's kind of fascinating that almost any mathematician will look at these jottings and know exactly what Mary Somerville is trying to do. On the right-hand side, she just has ij equals k, ik equals j, and jk equals I, which means almost nothing to most people on the planet. But any mathematician will look at that and be like, quaternions, which were these, they were developed in the mid-19th century. They were incredibly useful, but they also kind of started algebra. So for anyone who hates algebra, it's thanks to quaternions that it like exists in the way it does, rather than as Mary Somerville had been using algebra as a tool to study the sciences. With quaternions, algebra became something that mathematicians were studying for its own sake, studying structures and things like that. For anyone who hates algebra but loves video games, quaternions are very important for video games. You can do 3D rotations really easily, which means that you can, they're very useful for creating the graphics and for creating the different views and how your perspective changes as you play the video game. So pros and cons of quaternions. But yeah, their like innate definition are these formulae, ij equals k, ik equals j. And so immediately I'm thinking, why on earth is she studying quaternions? Why did that happen? How did she come across these? She's never really been interested in algebra for algebra's sake before. So this is a whole different aspect to her mathematical life that we now have an insight into. Because we have some of her letters and her collection of books, now I know why. She was visited by an American professor called Benjamin Peirce in 1870, and when he left, he sent her a book that has been described as completely intractable by many contemporary mathematicians. And so when she tried to read it, she also found it incredibly difficult. So again, she wrote to the president, or the then president of the London Mathematical Society, asking for help, and she sent her a book on quaternions by Peter Guthrie Tait. Her copy of this book is held by Girton as part of her collection, and it has a little bit of marginalia. And we have a couple of her letters between these people where she's asking for advice and being told which books to read. I wrote my PhD thesis in 2020 and 2021, which means I did not have a lot of access to archives during that time. And so once I'd finished my PhD, I thought, okay, I like all of those footnotes that say, I don't know yet, this thing exists in the archive, but I can't look at it. I thought maybe I should just go and have a look and see what is there. So I went to Oxford, went to the Bodleian, and got out a box which was supposed to have a book of notes that Somerville had taken as she was writing Mechanism of the Heavens. It made absolutely no mention about these 80 pages of notes that she'd taken on Peter Guthrie Tait's quaternions. And so again, a very serendipitous surprise. I was like, great, now I have even more material to kind of access this moment in Somerville's life. And actually, it has such incredible pedagogical value because what we have here is the notes that she's taking as she is reading Guthrie Tait. And so something that's really hard to drill into mathematicians sometimes is like you have to read, but you also have to read with your pen in your hand. And so being able to witness somebody doing this and not just looking at the examples and being like, oh, I wonder when I'm going to get the model solutions from my lecturer, and actually sitting down and trying to write your own model solutions or get to the answer yourself is really interesting and really useful to sort of share with students. So yeah, we can see her here writing out some solutions to some of the examples, so this kind of active reading. She's making connections with other books that she's read. So Hamilton is the name written on the left-hand side, and he's the person who's kind of is credited with inventing quaternions. And so she's obviously read his book as well. She's matching up these ideas. So again, a bit of active reading. And she's also got, within these papers, there's sometimes rough copies and then neat copies of the exact same content that she's written up. And so trying to compare these, why did she write up neat copies? What's changed? Has anything changed? Is an interesting question to ask. And so all of this brings me to the transcription project. which happened in just this summer at the Open University. So May 12th is Women in Mathematics Day, in honor of a woman called Mariam Mirzakhani, who was the very first woman to win the Nobel Prize of Mathematics called the Fields Medal. She very sadly died just a few years later. The Open University is a distance learning university, which means all of our undergraduates are distance learners, and a lot of our staff also work remotely. However, we do have a campus in Milton Keynes where central academics are based, and also a lot of PhD students are based, mostly full-time students. So we have that academic, that research community, but we also, that kind of exists in person and online. And if anyone knows hybrid, that means you just do everything twice. Yeah, so we wanted to run some events that could be asynchronous and online, and kind of create a bit of community between our students, who again are coming out of COVID, so have had even fewer opportunities to meet each other that they might have done previously in their studies. So this was run as an online event. We started with a lecture about Mary Somerville, kind of introducing these resources and why we wanted to have them transcribed. And then we requested volunteers. Oh, actually, I can just stay on that slide. We requested volunteers who we then put into groups and sort of chunked up the archival material, which was scanned by the Bodleian, and they very kindly provided me with a scan of most of the pages. So I could then chunk up the PDF and just assign that to different groups. We specifically signed them up into, or assigned them into groups so that they could check their own work to try and limit the amount of work that I had to do, because this was just a fun summer project, to kind of create a bit of community. So they were encouraged to check their own work. They had this forum where they could communicate with other people on their team. They could point out areas that they were struggling to pass, or sometimes if they didn't understand what was going on in the mathematics. It is very interesting. There was like an entire forum thread that one of the volunteers started, and they sort of started really hesitantly. They were like, Brigitte, I'm really sorry, but Mary Somerville really doesn't understand what's going on here. Like, everything she's written is complete nonsense. Like, it's really hard to pass. She's clearly misunderstood, or like her solution doesn't make any sense. And he did it in like quite an apologetic way of like, oh no, this means that like the resource isn't really that helpful, or like, oh no, that woman that you've spent 8 years researching is dumb. And I was like, no, this is great. Like, she's literally 90 years old, like reading a book on mathematics that no one else can understand. And now we can see what she is struggling with. Because this was a type of, like, at that time, this mathematics, people didn't know what the right answer was all the time. It was still very exploratory. It was still very new. And this is something that math students are really not used to. Like, they think that even if they don't understand, there is a lecturer that they can go to who can just give them the right answer, explain the right answer. The right answer is known and is right. And actually at this time, that's just not true at all. And so it's providing like a very different perspective on mathematics for the student. And also it's quite useful for me, so I can be like, it helps me understand kind of what is going on and what Mary Somerville is writing. So afterwards, we did ask for some student feedback, and it was all resoundingly positive. So the students specifically enjoyed contributing to a piece of academic research. They felt like it was very valuable what they were doing. It gave them an insight into what it meant to do historical research, which as mathematicians, they probably didn't think they would get during their course. They felt like they were doing something meaningful, and that kind of the moment of deciphering something difficult, which is like maps really well into maths as well, of like sometimes it's really difficult and you just have to sit and stare at it, and then maybe one day that eureka moment will come. And so that kind of building that resilience, building that idea of being comfortable not knowing, being comfortable being stuck, is really useful in both history and in maths. And getting involved in looking at this handwritten work. And just to say that one student who volunteered on this has now been hired to work with me as an intern for 3 months. So there is a bit of a track of like sort of looping people in that maybe otherwise wouldn't have done this. And also being able to carry it forward. I did feel very seen when you were talking about researchers who just really love the research but don't think about the output. Right now, the output is TBC, but we really enjoyed the research. I think as I'm sure will maybe be brought up in future talks today, the kind of landscape of transcription and digitizing is changing quite a lot. So maybe in the future, rather than everything being handwritten, we might use something called MathPics, where you can take a photo of handwritten mathematics and it'll immediately typeset it into LaTeX. And so maybe there'll be more focus on checking that and making sure that that's correct rather than starting from scratch. But to be honest, this kind of student project, I really think it's valuable to do the whole work yourself. Like, that's how you gain understanding. That's how you sort of build up the skills that we were thinking about with this project. And also LaTeX does provide quite a few accessibility limitations, which need to be thought through. So actually this project, everybody transcribed into Word, which is more accessible to the students, but then does make the output maybe slightly less easy to use. And maybe I can just use MathPics to change it from Word to LaTeX. Yeah. So just to finish with the quote that one day might be tattooed on my body, and which kind of sums up the spirit of this project of exposing students to historical mathematics. I think it's within maths, sometimes there's a very implicit historical narrative that you get fed without even realizing. A lot of theorems are named after specific people. And those people are usually white European men from the 19th century. And also the way that it is usually taught is something that has been revamped and revised so that everything leads on from itself and you kind of know exactly where you're going. And then at the end, you maybe like learn a specific theorem or a big result, and you know where you started and you know where you're going, and everything is very discrete. And so using primary sources to kind of interrogate that narrative and actually look at the work that went into making this new knowledge that we can now present in a discrete way, showing people getting lost, showing people hitting dead ends and not quite understanding what is going on, which is really important for anyone who might want to go on into mathematical research. And also exposing them to, showing students that there are people who were like them that did maths, and that maths has a really global reach. And it's really exciting to do that through primary sources. For example, maybe presenting students with sources in their own language, if English is not their first language, or people, who are where they are from, and things like that. So obviously, Somerville was chosen because it was Women in Maths Day, and she talks about tenacity by saying that, this was when she was doing this work on quaternions. She says, "I'm now in my 92nd year, still able to drive out for several hours. I am extremely deaf, and my memory of ordinary events, and especially of the names of people, is failing, but not for mathematical and scientific subjects. I'm still able to read books on the higher algebra for 4 or 5 hours in the morning, and even to solve the problems. Sometimes I find them difficult, but my old obstinacy remains, for if I do not succeed today, I attack them again on the morrow," which is just a really lovely quote about resilience and trying again the next day. I shared this with the students to kind of explain to them why it's worth looking at these primary sources, and I think they agreed. So here are some places where you can find out more about history of maths, and specifically Mary Somerville. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
My question, Brigitte, was going to be, I think it was Sam mentioned earlier about primary sources not just being for historians and thinking about those other disciplines. How did the mathematics students find looking at these primary sources when you first presented them to them?
I think there was definitely a lot of, it was really great to see discussion on the forum of trying to figure out what is going on in the sources. Quaternions are not something you would learn in an undergraduate course, so it was something very new. And also there's the tension between maybe trying to find a research paper nowadays about quaternions, and then which actually will be incredibly distracting and incredibly unhelpful because it has a robust framework that these people didn't have in the 19th century. And so yeah, I think the students reacted really well. I think they found it really interesting to do that and to see this kind of development of mathematics in a way that's not so curated as they usually get in their like textbooks and lectures. So yeah, and maths is really interesting in that there is just like the fact that I'm a historian of maths in a maths department might sound quite surprising, maybe it doesn't, but actually there's such a long history of mathematicians being interested in the history of their own discipline. And so there is quite a long research tradition of that. And it does bleed through in mathematical papers. And so kind of showing students that kind of aspect of mathematical research, I think can be quite eye-opening. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Was there much preparation you did with your students, like in terms of paleography or anything like that to support this, because it looks hard what they did?
Yeah, I think so, there was preparation. It's going to sound incredibly underwhelming. I wrote them a Word doc, which had some like helpful hints and tips of what to do. I think this is another reason I wanted them to work in groups. Something that I put in the Word doc is like, you will not understand everything. Like sometimes it's about parsing the words, sometimes it's about parsing the even like the symbols that are being used. Luckily, because this was Somerville's notes of a book, and the book has been digitized, they could read them side by side, which is sometimes really helpful to kind of parse what is going on. But yeah, because this was like a fun event rather than a transcription project per se, the focus was more. The students like weren't getting paid or anything like that, so I didn't want them to feel like they had to invest a lot of time into it. It was more of seeing like what they could get out of it in a short period of time. So yeah, I wrote them like a little how-to doc, and then they were encouraged to ask each other questions on the forum, which they did do. But they definitely would not have heard the word paleography.
So you mentioned that one of the things that they learned was that getting the wrong answer was almost as interesting, or not being able to get the answer was as interesting as getting the right answer. And I wondered if there was anything else like that students learned when they were using the historical sources, as opposed to their kind of general mathematical disciplines.
Of like other skills that are useful in maths, or
other skills from using the primary sources actually that was maybe contrary to what they thought their understanding of doing maths day to day was.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm going to reflect very briefly. I guess it's the thing of getting the wrong answer, obviously. Can then be dug down into of like, okay, what do we learn from like having the wrong answer? But also something that it doesn't really come up so much in this project. I'm working with students on a couple of other projects with history of maths as well. But something that I really try and encourage them to do is like when they read a proof. So like when I teach a history of maths course to mathematicians, the thing that they always do is I'll give them a source and I'll be like, write about this source, and they'll be like, this source is the most important thing ever written because, and I'm like, you only think that because I gave it to you, like, so you think it therefore must be important. Like, I could have given you something incredibly banal and I want you to argue that it's like, it's wrong, or like nobody read it because it's in an obscure language, or nobody read it because it's in an obscure journal. And also kind of like, maybe it was acceptable, like maybe the proof was kind of widely accepted at the time, but nowadays we wouldn't accept it because there's like a massive gaping hole in it that they like didn't even realize was there because their concept of number is different to our concept of number. And so something that I think is really important as a math student is to be able to critique proofs and to be able to look at, so I guess, for example, Mary Somerville's solutions to these examples, being able to look at that and be like, actually, that's not a solution, and this is why it's not a solution, then means when they go and do their worksheets, they can look at their own work and be like, oh, is that a whole? Is that a whole? And actually have some just conviction in themselves that like they are an expert in something. And sometimes it is the right thing to say, actually, this is wrong and this is why. So I think that's like a skill useful in both areas too. Thank you for letting me reflect very briefly, very visibly, but very briefly.
I have one more, if that's okay. I'd be interested to know, you mentioned that lots of mathematicians are interested in the history of the discipline. I'm interested to know how far that extends into the teaching. So in undergraduate maths courses, for example, or even postgraduate, are there many opportunities for students to do this kind of research? Or is it something that's maybe unique to your summer project?
Quite a few universities, probably a minority, but like quite a few universities do offer history of maths courses as part of their undergraduate teaching. They're often used in this sort of way of skills building. So like a lot of my lectures as an undergraduate just kind of had accidental history. Like if a named theorem came up, the lecturer would say a bit about who that person was. Although that's maybe to a historian really not history, but anyway, so it does come up quite a lot. Something I still find really interesting is like I'll go to a research talk by a mathematician and they will just like reference a paper from like 1920s Russia, and I'll be like, oh wow, do you like read Russian? And they'll be like, no, it's just known that that is the paper where everything comes from. And I'm like, but how is it just known? Like who's read this paper, who's decided that this is like the canonical thing that you should reference? So because of this kind of tradition and expectation of back referencing, it almost like people will situate themselves in like a historical narrative even if they don't think consciously that that's what they're doing, which is really interesting. But yeah, so it's relatively unusual, and especially to go beyond like a skills building class to actually doing research in history of maths. But St Andrews has a really robust program, the OU, Oxford, and maybe a couple other places. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. That was
Thank
brilliant.
you.